I mentioned recently that one of my personal goals is to get really good at breeding Apistogrammas. I've got a long way to go still, but in my time working with Agassizii, I think I learned a couple of things that will help me as I move forward with other species. It's not new information, I've heard it before, but sometimes I have to see things for myself before I can really internalize them. I'll share some of those observations as we move on, but for now, let's start at the beginning. I always spend some time on sexing, and for this species I think it's very easy to tell male from female, at least for the common color strain that I've dealt with. I also wanted to mention that if you order Apistos online, you can often find them sold as attempted pairs. These days I buy most of my fish from the wet spot in Oregon, and so far they've done a great job of sending pairs. If you do need to pick males and females out of a shop tank, there's a few things you can look out for. First, the males should be noticeably larger, even at a young age, and depending on the strain, there should also be substantial differences in color and pattern. Now this can vary with their mood and health, but females should typically have a distinct yellow color. Differences in fin shape can also be helpful. Male Agassizii don't have the prominent dorsal spine extensions that I've seen in some other species, but in general, all the fins should be longer, more angular, and more colorful on a male and more compact and subtle on a female. In particular, I would pay attention to differences in the ventral and caudal fins. On a male, the ventral fins are long, thin, and more colorful, and on a female, they're shorter and broader, and they'll often have a black stripe running down the leading edges. Notice also that on a female, the caudal fin is round with muted color, where on males, they're more spade-shaped and a lot more colorful. Next, I wanted to touch on strategies for introducing a male and female to a breeding tank. I'm still making up my mind on the right way to do this, but I have a couple thoughts. If the male and female lived together previously, moving them to a breeding tank at the same time seems to provoke the least amount of aggression. On the other hand, I found them to spawn sooner if I add the female first and give her time to explore, claim, and get comfortable with a spawning cave. Really, as soon as you put a pair in the same space, the male will start harassing the female to breed, and if she doesn't feel ready, she might go hide in a corner and sulk for a few weeks. It sets things off on the wrong foot. Like I said, I'm still thinking about this, but I'm leaning right now towards introducing a female first. The downside, or at least a predictable consequence, is that she might be much more protective of the space when it comes time to introduce the male. And that's what you see here. I know this looks alarming, but these same two fish spawn just a day or two later. I feel like I've been almost evangelical about the likelihood of success with arbitrary pairings. I really don't believe that you need to get a big group of fish and then let them play the bachelorette until someone finds a soulmate. Certainly an arbitrary pair can experience some aggression while they get comfortable with each other, but really, any two cichlids can decide to murder each other at any time, paired or not. I've seen it. What matters more, I think, is arranging tanks in such a way that they can go through periods of aggression without anyone getting seriously hurt. I always recommend including some plants and hardscape to create line of sight breaks and hiding places, but there's something else I wanted to mention that I've found helpful with this and other species. If you notice this perforated plastic sheet, this is a cheap tank divider that I think I got at Petco. I keep a couple of these around, and if I ever see what looks like a concerning level of aggression, I'll drop these in the middle of the tank. I've trimmed them down so that there's some gap, usually near the top of the tank. The fish can still technically cross from one side to the other, but it makes it really inconvenient to chase each other around. They can still get together and breed, but during bad weeks, I'm quite certain these partial dividers have saved lives for me. To encourage spawning, I like to condition the fish with live foods, primarily baby brine shrimp and Daphnia. I sometimes use frozen bloodworms, but that's something I approach with some caution, given the risk of bloating, so if I do, it's in very small amounts. You might have noticed we're looking at a couple of different tanks, and I'll talk about tank setup in just a few minutes. I have some 10 gallons that are arranged in a way that helps me film the breeding process, so let me talk through that first. Apistos look for some kind of enclosed shelter to lay their eggs, and in aquariums we usually give them some kind of artificial cave with a defensible entrance and a reasonable internal volume. In this case I'm using a clay pot with openings that allow for filming, but I'll show another good option later. There are a few things you can look for that are good indicators you might have a spawn coming soon. In general, you should notice the fish spending a good deal of time in and around the cave. Sometimes the males can be a bit oblivious, but at the very least you should see the female spending a conspicuous amount of time inside the cave. You might not see this in a normal setting, but in the day or two before spawning, the female will spend time cleaning the cave by pecking around at the surfaces, especially the ceiling. If the male is paying attention, you might notice him flaring his fins at the female. I've mentioned this before, but I've observed this to be a context-dependent gesture. It could be territorial aggression, but it could also be a warning signal of perceived danger nearby, or before breeding, it can be an attempt to show the female that he's a good reproductive partner. The females have their own gestures too. They're famous for the tail whipping, but again, it isn't always aggressive. In my opinion, the single clearest signal of an imminent spawn is when a female rolls over on her side to display her belly full of eggs to the male. In some cases, this can be a submissive gesture to ease aggression from the male, but if she does it near a cave, it probably means she's ready. Immediately before the spawn, you might see the female moving in and out of the cave, trying to get the male's attention and lead him inside. Once they're both inside, she'll start making repeated passes over the cave ceiling, adhering eggs in kind of a loose cluster. While she does this, the male will sit there, watch and wait, and periodically release milt in the general direction of the egg cluster. I've found it odd but consistent between 4 species now that the males don't make close contact with the eggs like I've seen from some other cichlid species. I learned from watching cockatoides that they're capable of fertilizing from outside the cave, so on some level this makes sense, but it seems like a good assumption that closer is better for fertilization. For that reason, I've been choosing to use caves with an opening large enough for the male to come inside. I know he might eat some eggs or fry later, but during the spawn I don't see a downside. Sometime later in the day I just remove the male, and things seem to work out fine. While we watch this, I wanted to share some detail on water parameters. I like 80 degrees Fahrenheit for the temperature, but pH and hardness has been a bit of a struggle for me. In general, I try to avoid being in a situation where I have to tamper with the water chemistry, and if ever possible, I prefer my fish to just adjust to my tap water. Everything is easier that way. In this case, it didn't quite work for me. Now, I was able to breed cockatoides and McMasteri in tap water, but these Agassizii seem to require softer and more acidic water. They'll spawn like clockwork even at a higher pH. The problem is that the eggs won't hatch. Some part of the fertilization process must be chemically impeded. And I'm not happy to be the bearer of bad news, but I do say that with some confidence. I let multiple pairs spawn for about 8 months with 0 fertility before immediately succeeding on the first attempt at a lower pH. It doesn't have to be incredibly low. For me, it was 6.6. I think you just need to be comfortably below neutral. I brought the pH down through gradual water changes with reverse osmosis water. This pH issue is probably the most important thing I took away from the whole experience, and I suspect will be consistent for most of the other species I try to breed going forward. There are some added challenges when working with soft acidic water, but I'll touch on that later. In the right water chemistry, these eggs would take roughly 2 to 3 days to hatch, then another 5 or 6 before the fry become free swimming. Now these eggs here didn't hatch, so let's take a look at the tank where I actually got fry. This was a 20 long with the soft acidic water I talked about earlier, and an arrangement that I think is a fairly good example of tank setup for breeding apistos. I used a fine sand substrate because it's very natural for them. I had a coconut hut as their spawning cave with some overhead plant cover, and also placed a larger plant in the middle of the tank to act as a line of sight break between both ends. I used a sponge filter and placed it on the opposite end of the tank from the cave because I think strong water flow is another impediment to their already weak approach to fertilization. At some point I did add some tannins to the water. I don't think it'll make or break a breeding attempt, but it does seem to make them feel a little more comfortable out in the open spaces of the tank, so why not? And here's the happy couple, doing what they do best, still optimistic and telling themselves the 18th time's the charm. It's a lot less interesting from the outside, isn't it? We're spoiled now with hidden cameras. In this larger tank, the male ended up voluntarily sequestering himself to the other end, but I did eventually remove him. Skip forward a week and we'll start to see some fry. Do you see that little raised knot of driftwood on the right side? That's where I saw them first. I noticed the female hanging around that area for longer than she would normally stay away from her fry, so I went around to the other side and noticed she had them all piled up in a dugout space under the driftwood. She wasn't trying to relocate them permanently, they're still very reliant on that cave, but I learned before that the females like to bring the fry outside during the day to give them opportunities to move around and maybe start looking for food if they're hungry. So every morning she would bring them outside, and then each night she would herd them back into the cave for safety. Now, this here was a bit early to be bringing them outside in my opinion, but who am I to question her parenting skills? After another day, the fry all seemed to be up and moving, and this is where I typically start feeding. If you recall from the cockatoides, I started with a fry powder mixed with water and released around the fry. It's small and easy to eat, and I think a good measure to help the fry grow just enough to start eating baby brine shrimp comfortably. It worked great in that case, but sometimes I just have to try things. It's a compulsion. I've bred some other dwarf cichlids with fry that are totally comfortable eating brine shrimp on their first day, and I wanted to see if using fry powder was me being excessively cautious. So this time I fed only baby brine shrimp, and what I found was the larger 50% of the spawn did just fine. The smaller half did not. I started with somewhere around 60 fry, and over the next couple of days dropped to about 30. So okay, lesson learned. I'll stick with the previous approach. The remainder did fine, and I kept on feeding brine shrimp. And in general, I feed 2 or 3 times a day, but with brine shrimp, they kind of scatter around the tank, and I also tend to feed a little more than the fry would want at one time. What that leads to is longer periods of the day where if the fry go out looking for food, they'll find it. Better they eat in small amounts over time than large amounts all at once. Over the next several weeks, the fry grew steadily, and as they got stronger, they also became a bit more independent. In the early days, they tend to stay real close to the female, but right around this size here, they started to spread out more throughout the tank. The female also transitioned gradually from being very protective to almost indifferent to the fry, and then eventually somewhat aggressive towards them. This shift happened a bit earlier than I've seen in the past, but I think there's a reason for it. She was ready to spawn again, and she wanted to clear out the area. I've always been curious how fish like this deal with having eggs ready, but no partner available or no suitable environment to spawn. I've seen females lay eggs in places where they couldn't even hope for them to hatch, but in this case, she handled it differently. She dropped the eggs mid-water and then turned around and ate them to reclaim the invested nutrients. It's a little bit gross, but interesting. I'm glad I saw this. Knowing that she was now somewhat of a danger to the fry, I removed the female from the tank also. By that time, they would do just fine without her. Since then, the fry have continued to grow, and other than steady feeding and some smaller, more cautious water changes, there really wasn't much else to it. This isn't a huge number of fish, and unless I want to reset this tank for another species, I don't have a pressing need to move these into a larger space. What I do have is a water chemistry issue I need to deal with before I can sell them. While the low pH was necessary for breeding, if I don't get them adjusted to tap water, it wouldn't be safe to take them to a store. I started changing in very small amounts of tap water early on, but the pH is still fairly low. What I need to do now is more frequently change in small amounts of tap water until it gets back to normal for my area. I'm not so worried about the fish themselves, they're pretty adaptable, but more about the biological filtration. I checked on that periodically, and while I don't think nitrification ever stopped completely, it definitely slowed down. And that's not really dangerous in a low pH, but as it increases, I need time for the bacteria to scale back up, proportionate to the increasing ammonia toxicity. Like I said, it's an added layer of complexity, but it's well worth it to me, and should be great preparation for some other species. For now, I think that'll do it for the Agassizii, and as for next time, I haven't quite decided yet. Emperor Tetras I think are the closest to being ready, but we'll see. Either way, I'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.